Welcome to episode 87 of the Hard Truth About B2B E-commerce. I'm your co-host, Isaiah Bollinger. Unfortunately, Tim is not with us today, so we won't have the exciting normal shout-outs and intro that Tim brings to the table, but we'll certainly be back for the next episode. So let's pause for a minute for the sponsor slot, and we'll get back to it.
Hello, everyone. I'd like to give you a word from our sponsors. Our first sponsor is Balance. Balance is a B2B e-commerce payment solution that works well for you and for your buyers. It offers a seamless one-click checkout for almost any payment method, including ACH, wire, checks, cards, even terms. It's used by leaders in B2B e-commerce, and it's as easy as buying a shirt from Amazon. Check them out at getbalance.com. Book a session and tell them what your needs are. They are the first dedicated payment platform for B2B e-commerce, 100% tailored to your needs. Thanks again to our sponsor, Balance. Our next sponsor is TradeCentric. TradeCentric transforms the way businesses transact by enabling punch-out, purchase order, and invoice automation solutions for over 3,000 companies around the world. Uniquely positioned at the intersection of e-commerce and e-procurement, TradeCentric helps B2B buyers connect with suppliers and automate payment, procurement processes to drive greater efficiency and user adoption of streamlined systems. Learn more at tradecentric.com. Thank you to our sponsors.
Okay, great. I'm super excited for our guest. He's actually, I think he invited me first to his show, his podcast. I mean, he has video content, everything online. So Sam Gupta, I guess, would you say you're the CEO and founder of Elevate IQ? Is that how you would describe your title, or?
Most popular title is principal consultant, but yes, I am the CEO and founder, but I don't think that is commercialized as much as principal consultant.
Sure. So you guys, you have some similarities to what I do at Trellis, but honestly, on kind of a very different side of the coin, which is, a lot of our work is front-facing design, front-end development, marketing. We do a lot of integrations and operations work, but we're not the ones really running the back office, and that's your specialty. So tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got to where you are now, and just so people understand the perspective.
Yeah, happy to. First of all, thank you so much for inviting me. It's always a pleasure talking to you, Isaiah. And a little bit about me. I have been in this space for 20 years, I guess. Started consulting.
Don't look that old.
I'm probably not going to look as old even when I'm going to be 50, because our genes are different. My father and I look very similar, to be honest. Okay, so you can believe, and he's now 80, I guess, and
wow.
he has very black hair, full.
Wow. I'm jealous. I won't have that, but go ahead.
Yeah. So have been around the block for roughly 20 years, started consulting with one of the largest consulting firms. And I was brought in one of the most complex engagements, I would say, from the enterprise architecture, from the ERP perspective, typically broken engagements. And they would be broken for so many different reasons. And Isaiah, you are living this life, right? I mean,
Yeah, the problem is I can't always fix it because I'm not the ERP implementer or the consultant, but I know when it's broken.
Honestly speaking, I mean, the reality of these engagements is that, nobody can really fix them. And the reason for that is because it's never just the technical problems, okay? It's never just the process problems. It's also the people aspect of the problem, which is going to be equally critical. So people, process, technology. So we are going to get into all of that during the podcast, but let me finish the intro first. Okay, so 20 years roughly, then Elevate IQ, we started roughly 5-ish years back. And the focus of Elevate IQ is we help companies in selecting, integrating, implementing any of the enterprise systems. So typically our role, as you correctly pointed out, that it's going to be slightly more backend, which is going to be, okay, how can ERP talk to e-commerce? How can e-commerce talk to your POS? How can the whole enterprise architecture is going to work? Not just from the marketing perspective, from the operational, procurement, MRP, production. If you have manufacturing, obviously that is there. Retail, merchandising, planning, all of that combined. So typically, it's going to be everything as part of our engagement. Now, obviously, as you know, I'm very community focused as well. Produce a lot of content. So we have WBS Rocks podcast, which focuses on ERP, e-commerce, supply chain, Industry 4.0, so many different topics, very similar to what you guys cover. Is that a good start?
Yeah, I have two questions to kind of follow up on that. One, why did you go out on your own? Like, you could keep working for some of these companies. What kind of made you want to do something on your own? Then I will follow up to that.
Yeah. So honestly speaking, I never wanted to do this myself. I was pushed into it by my wife, and she felt that,
Wow.
Okay. She is the idea person. Okay. And she has wonderful ideas. And she felt that, what? Anybody can start a company. Okay. You can start a company. And we, at that time when I started, she had I think we had $8,000 in cash in total. Everything else was sort of invested for us. So we didn't have real money. And she was like, no, you can start in $8,000. No big deal. And I've done it.
Well, the nice thing about services is it's not that expensive to start a services company, professional services,
Obviously, we ended up selling our house, to be honest, or a couple of houses, I guess. That's how we survived in the company. So It was never $8,000. Obviously, you require a lot more, in running a real company, and we had to build our operational capacity. Otherwise, we cannot survive in the market. So, obviously, she pushed me into that, okay, it's going to be easy because I've done it, but obviously she has not done it. So starting a company is very hard in general. At least that's been my experience. And I knew that from the get-go. And that's why I never wanted to start, to be honest. I would rather work for somebody else.
So you're in it. Are you happy that now that you've done it on your own, you're maybe past those tough stages, or do you feel like you're past the really tough early stages?
I mean, with business, it's always going to be critical. This idea, right? See whether you are going to be, 5 million, 10 million, 100 million. Cash is always a problem, right? But I think we are past the stage where we don't have to worry about paying our bills. Exactly.
Yeah, you're not worried about the surprise, like $500,
No.
Yeah. So the other thing that's been interesting is you've taken a very ERP agnostic approach, which I find pretty unique. Most of the challenge that I find in the space is everyone's all about NetSuite, or they're all about, Microsoft, and it's Oracle, or they're just so locked into one solution because that's what they know, and they just don't see. It's hard to get a perspective on the space that's objective. One, it's really complex, right? Just learning the differences is really hard. And two, it just seems like most companies, they focus on one or two, even some of the big agencies, or big consulting firms.
Yeah. And honestly speaking, when you get into the depth of ERP, some of the bigger ones, they are very, very, very hard to master for just one person. In most ERP engagements, even if you are going for the smaller ERP engagements, typically you are going to have roughly 7 consultants working together, even though they might be telling the client that, okay, it's just one person or 2 people, but underneath they might have 6 or 7 different skill sets that might be partnering. And by the way, we are talking just about ERP right now. When you get into the ERP plus eCom plus your WMS plus TMS, and I'm talking about slightly bigger systems, right? It gets very complicated. All of these teams need to work together. So in general, it requires a lot more expertise in general to be able to deliver these products. And that's why you will never find a company that is going to specialize in multiple ERPs. It's very, very, very hard to maintain that expertise. In my case,
so how do you guys do it? How do you do it?
Exactly. And it's very hard, to be honest. Okay. And I personally have invested a lot of time in the agnostic space. Before doing this, I told you my background was, fixing these larger engagements. So then I got exposed to a lot of different systems, and I really need to learn what was happening inside those systems. And that's why I am sort of deep in every single of them. But again, I mean, we implement some of them. We are not going to claim that we know every single system in the world. It's very, very, very hard expertise.
Name some of the ones that you feel like you know pretty well, and you'd bet on yourself to know better than most people. Like,
yeah, so there is the selection phase, there is the implementation phase. When you get, and typically when you are building the team, you are going to require 7, 8, sometimes 15, sometimes 100 different consultants. So most of the time, it's going to be a very hybrid team that is working together, and the clients that have done this, they already
let's talk about the selection process. So
yeah,
if you start there, how would you approach it?
So for the selection process, the way we like to do this is, we are going to look at the entire enterprise architecture. So number one thing is going to be, okay, what are your as-is processes? That is going to be, okay, we are going to be looking at your transactions. How are you processing your transactions right now? That is going to be starting from your chart of accounts. How are your SKUs designed? How are your warehouse processes? How many different channels do you have? How are you reconciling your inventory? So these are very, very, very deep analytical questions, and we are analyzing every single transaction, and then we are trying to build the architecture. Okay, ERP is playing this role, because ERP, people always throw this word ERP, but ERP could mean a lot of different things to different size of the company, to different.
Yeah, sometimes it's HR.
Exactly.
Most of the time it's not HR, but sometimes, it could be like, usually I think it's almost better. I think I kind of hate the word. I think we should break it down as like, okay, so you have accounting, you have inventory, you have order management. Like, can you kind of break that down on some of the core functions that you see, or the ones that are kind of the most critical? Accounting is definitely.
So the challenge with that approach is, and I think some people have tried that, okay? So then what happens is, then these accounting systems, they are going to sell themselves as ERP. Inventory system, they are going to sell them as.
And I'm not necessarily saying that you should have a different system for all of them, but what are the core things that you look for in an ERP? I know this is a very general question. It's going to depend on the business, but.
Yeah, so again, depending upon the business, I would say, depending upon the business processes, some of them are going to be extremely integrated. If they are not, then the business will not be able to get results. So for example, let's say if you get into the manufacturing, or you get into the industrial distribution, that's where you are going to have much tighter role of the ERP. The kind of processes that they
break that down, right? Because for the most part, you're not doing B2B commerce if you're not a manufacturer, you're not a distributor, right? Like, those are the two main people selling B2B commerce, right? So if you're a manufacturer, how would you approach it then? Let's start there, and we can go to distribution.
So for manufacturers, the manufacturing processes have to be hosted inside the ERP. Otherwise, their production is not going to work. Okay, so they have to be inside the ERP. They have to have the ERP as the source of record or the control, because the costing that you are going to get, and the costing is a term for unit economics that people use in the e-commerce space, but they typically don't have the real sense of the price, because they don't have the real sense of inventory either. Real sense of inventory comes when you are going to keep all of this in one system, and then you have to account for every single movement of the inventory. And typically when you are getting into that manufacturing space, because your inventory is not only controlled by your incoming inventory and the outgoing inventory, it is also controlled by, okay, how many dependencies do you have in your BOMs? Okay, and BOM, if your audience is not familiar, it's going to be a bill of material. So sometimes, let's say if you are producing a car, okay, a demand could be driven by just based on a part, because you might be selling that as the spare part, or you might be selling 40,000 cars, or each of those 40,000 cars may have dependency on a part, that may have further dependency on a part. So this is all inventory.
Yeah, so the manufacturing process is much more complicated in general, right? Because, it depends what you're making, right? You'd be making something really simple, but the more parts, the more things that are in it, the more you have to track all the costs of everything that goes into the product, right? So.
Exactly. So that's where the costing comes from when you look at the manufacturing process. Now, let's say if you are not doing manufacturing, the only thing you are doing is the distribution. Okay, you are hiring your vendors.
So if you're a manufacturer, would you say that's the most important thing? Like, making sure that that part is really good, right? Like, would you generally look for something that really fits that process? And if the other parts are maybe, let's say that part's a 10 out of 10 and the other parts are a 5 out of 10, would you generally select that? Or if another system is a 7 out of 10 out of everything? Like, is the manufacturing process within the ERP that important to the manufacturer that you would take the 10 out of 10, even if the other pieces are not as good in terms of like accounting and...
So obviously the consulting answer always is going to be it depends, right? But in this but in this particular case, if you are trying to break down the manufacturing boundaries, for the most part, you are probably going to run into a lot of different challenges. Because when you look at the whole bill of material of manufacturing, you are not only looking at the accounting perspective, you are looking at procurement perspective, you are looking at production. So everything is controlled by that BOM, bill of material. And that's nothing but your SKU. That's the inventory that you are trying to sell. So when you sell...
Yeah, it's everything that makes up your SKU, right? And your SKU could be like 5 things or 1,000 things that makes up one SKU, right? So, yeah.
Exactly. So everything is just so connected in the B2B space, especially when you talk about the manufacturing process. But then you get into a little distribution process. In that as well, how long is the transaction and what are you trying to do with the product? For example, let's say if you have warranty, field services scheduling, okay? If you have all of that, it's going to be really, really hard to create the commerce experience, okay? Because again, this all goes inside your BOM and they control your supply and demand. So for those patches, the ERP controls a lot more process in general. Now, let's talk about the commerce experience. Some people have tried to segment this, and what they are going to do is, okay, this is my sales sprint. For the sales sprint, what I'm going to do is I am not going to care what the ERP is doing. I'm simply going to capture the order. I'm somehow going to get these BOMs inside my e-commerce system and somehow going to capture the order and send it back to ERP and then let ERP figure out how they want to distribute and sell. So that could be another way of doing it, but there are going to be, the inventory is never going to be sort of connected because it's sitting in 2 different databases.
Yeah, and I think that's the biggest challenge that we see as like one of the the big barriers to B2B e-commerce is that they're running off these ERP systems for the most part. Like most B2B companies, manufacturing, distribution, or even like, let's say a retailer, a brand that has a B2B aspect, like their data is in some system that's usually not e-com, right? It's like NetSuite or whatever it may be. And that getting that data into the e-com experience is generally not simple, right? You have these solutions like Sligo, and there's definitely, they've come a long way, but the real-time information coming over, it's not so simple, right? I mean, I'm sure you've encountered that.
Yeah, and honestly speaking, regardless of the technology is not the problem here. It's building that reconciliation model, okay? It's the operational capacity that is typically the problem. Regardless of whether you are doing with Sligo, Boomi, or with other coding, it doesn't matter. This is not a technical problem. This is the design and architecture problem. How your information is flowing from one system to the next, from one department to the next, from one person to the next. And that is what creates the problem in the entire experience. That's what needs to be solved, to get the real experience if you're looking for seamless customer.
And I see this in B2B a lot. It feels like they're very resistant to changing their process, and especially if it means changing their core processes to make e-commerce work. So what I see happening a lot is people trying to kind of like hack the architecture to make e-commerce work for their ERP, which I think can be very challenging depending on the ERP and how it's designed,
Exactly. And we see that a lot as well, to be honest. And I always talk about this one, right? I mean, see, organizations are always going to have the political boundaries. They are going to have their own budgets. So sometimes it becomes very hard because, some of these things may take 2 or 3 years to get results from the ERP, and sales and marketing teams typically don't have as much time, so they are looking for low-hanging fruit.
That's the other problem, right? B2B e-commerce, I feel like, some of those projects, they could be 6, 12 months, 18 months if you want to do it well. And then it's not like you're going to get ROI like day that you launch. So now you're talking another 6, 12 months. Yeah, like you said, I mean, 3 years, there you go. If you think about it, right? If you're starting from scratch and trying to get ROI, it probably is 3 years.
Exactly. So I guess what organizations end up doing, to be honest, is, they are probably going to be wasting a lot of time and money, and they are probably not going to get, results with the effort. So either you want to do it right way or you want to do it hard way. Most organizations, the way they do it is hard way. Okay, if you want to do it right way, then typically what we recommend is, okay, build your architecture on a piece of paper. You don't have to design, you don't have to develop. Build your architecture on a piece of paper. Align everybody inside the organization that this is how we are going to be building the governance model. This is what is going to be everybody's roles and responsibilities. And this is how they are going to be handing off from one point to the next when the order moves from your e-com to your ERP to your WMS to just design your organizational structure. Once you have that, then figure out, okay, what are the low-hanging fruits? If you don't put this down on a piece of paper, it's number one, even if you try to develop something, it's not going to work. Because the developers, they are doing something. They don't talk to business. They don't understand business as deeply. So that's why this whole process
our developers don't touch anything until it's gone through a lot of upfronts. And that's, I think, a challenge, right? It's hard to get people sometimes to invest in the upfront. They're just like, no, give me a quote. How much they're going to cost to e-commerce, and they want us to just like start working on it. It's like, and you're right. It's better to spend 6 months designing an architecture that's going to work for the business than just building something that's on the wrong foundation.
Exactly. And sometimes that could be tricky for businesses as well. And obviously, there are a lot of different consulting companies, Isaiah, you know how this works, right? Obviously, any market, you are going to have a little bit of noise as well. So sometimes, the consulting companies also spend a lot of time in the strategy, but then that doesn't get executed. So obviously, that's going to be that challenge that, let's say, if I spend 6 months in this process, and then if it doesn't work, then what are we going to do? So obviously, the businesses have to think about, what is the sort of the middle ground. And that's where, they need to be putting enough effort in the design, in the architecture, and then finally implement slowly.
There's a middle ground. Yeah, we try and find that middle ground, and usually we'll try and do some discovery architecture in 4 to 8 weeks, but then we'll leave it as like, hey, we want to make sure the key things are known, so that even if we're figuring some things out after that, they're not going to be like deal breaker things. You know what I mean? They're kind of like maybe additional details, but we know that they're not going to affect the overall architecture. So yeah, it's tough, right? It's like how much you do upfront that helps you mitigate risk, but also not so much that you're just doing consulting and theoretical work forever. You know what I mean? It's like there's definitely a tough balance there. And I think that, like you said, it probably depends, right? Sometimes it could be 4 weeks, could be 8 weeks, could be 12 weeks. It's going to depend on the organization,
Exactly. And depending upon how much politics you have and how much control you have in the architecture. If you want to do it right way, again, you have to analyze everything together because they all are connected. They all are part of the same.
So let's talk about politics a little bit, because I think people don't realize how much politics and culture, especially in B2B e-commerce. I find B2C, and the reason I started this podcast, B2C is relatively straightforward. Most companies, they know they got to grow. It's Facebook, Google, drive traffic, convert it, sell more shit. Like, you know what I mean? It's like, maybe it's in-store, maybe it's online, maybe it's marketplace. They might have a little channel conflict. They might have some, politics there, but it's generally more straightforward. B2B, for whatever reason, I find gets way more political between ERP, departments. Sales reps don't like e-commerce because it's competing for their jobs. And we can get into that. Why? I maybe I'm wrong, but I just feel like my experience, B2B tends to be more political, and I think it's just maybe it's more complex. I don't know. What do you think about that?
Well, so I think I like to look at the evolution overall, how organizations grew and what changes are we expecting from the customer behavior perspective, right? So even the B2C organizations these days, if you look at, and depending upon how B2C are they, okay? If they are simply going to be a brick and mortar organization, maybe they are pure play DTC, then they don't have as much problem. As soon as you start talking about those cross-functional boundaries, that's where the real challenge is, regardless of B2C, B2B. Cross-functional is where the problem is, because the way companies are structured, they are structured per department. You allocate budget per department. You
Yeah, it's like
hire
tech
people
affects
for
marketing affects, and but they're just the sales effects. It's all connected, but it just gets siloed, right? And the bigger the company, the more silos for sure. Yeah.
Exactly. And that's where the CEO's role becomes very handy, because the CEO needs to be really, really deep in managing the expectations, where these cross-functional boundaries are going to be. Now, CEO cannot be
The
part
problem
of
that I see is a lot of CEOs are not technical and they don't know anything about this stuff. And I feel like that's where a big gap is, right?
And that's where I guess the consultants can really help. Again, there are a lot of CEOs who bring really good consultants in finding out, okay, how can we balance these boundaries? But again, if you are not going to give the power to those consultants, then obviously they are always going to have lower power than your internal employees, because your employees are hiring them.
Yeah.
So even if you hire them, I mean, it's not going to work, because they don't really have enough say in that.
They can't make any of the decisions. Yeah. Yeah.
Even if they
So
are
what's the
simply
solution? What's what do you do?
it's a leadership test. It's really a leadership test. The reason why the private equity, the companies that are owned by private equity or the public-centric organizations, they tend to do better is because they have gone through these cycles multiple times. They already know that the politics exist. And that's why they are trying to
They
build
stamp it out, they fire people, they get rid of it quickly. Yeah, I've seen that. Yeah. So I
That's why
still see them sometimes make bad decisions, but they're a lot more cut and dry about making quicker decisions, I'd say. Yeah.
exactly. And that's why they have the KPIs, and you have to hit the KPIs, and you are not going to be able to, you can fabricate KPIs. A lot of people
Eventually
do
they'll
that as
get
well,
caught. Yeah, for sure.
right? No, I mean, see, everything is not going to be as black and white. It's very hard. These things are real business, real world is very hard. Okay, so there is always going to be conflict between your sales KPIs versus your marketing KPIs. So you can probably make up your numbers, if you like. But again, I think this is where the test comes in from the leadership. What KPI are you really allocating to your people, and are you continuously monitoring those? Are they simply trying to make the numbers, or are they really meeting towards the goals of the organization where you are trying to head to? And again, that's where the leadership is very handy in general. The people who have done this multiple times, they sort of know which are the consultants that they should be talking to. They bring these consultants, and they typically take these things very comprehensively in general. But again, and that's why we have so much noise in the market, I guess. Not everybody is equally successful.
Yeah, I agree. It's a CEO cross-department executive leadership issue. But I find that a lot of B2B companies, they don't even want to get involved, right? Like they don't talk to me. Maybe they'll talk to you, right? Like they're like, oh, let our guy, like, it's like they'll just put someone in charge that has no real power to change anything.
Yeah.
To do the project, right? And then he's pretty much set up to fail, right? Because right? Because he has no power.
It's the experience, I'm telling you. I mean, if you look at the average SMB, the way they like to think, for them, it's going to be IT project, okay? Now, IT project is going to be very similar to your manufacturing. Now, let's think about how we manufacture. For manufacturing, you have to go through the engineering process. The only difference between manufacturing and producing a software, regardless of whether you are implementing a software or you are building it yourself, okay? You have to still go through the process. The process is, in the case of manufacturing, at least you have a CAD software, because you have defined number of variables that are controlling the outcome of your process. In the case of software, there is no CAD software in the world that can produce a software.
You can make anything. That's what people don't understand. They're like, well, why can't we have like a fixed cost? And I'm like, look, if you want to stay in the box of Shopify, like I'll do a fixed cost only on Shopify. And sometimes BigCommerce, because I can fit in that box. Yeah. And this is your scope. We're only going to do apps. You will get no custom apps. You will get no custom integrations. Maybe we'll do a little front end. Design is limited. That's the only way I can fit you in that box. Anytime I've done something trying to do fixed costs out of that, it's just impossible. Too many meetings, too expectation. It's just the paintbrush. You can paint anything, right? Like, right? I mean, I totally agree, right? There is no physical limit. You can make the pixels do anything, basically, right? Like, right?
And that's where the problem is. And that's why you have to go through the design process. Okay, which is the house that you are trying to build? Because at the end of the day,
it's like at least there's gravity, right? There is no gravity in software, like
that's why it is so difficult. I'm telling you, it's really difficult. And that's why following the process is even more important. But if you look at the average SMB, Isaiah, you already know this, right? You talk to average SMB, they don't follow the process.
They don't respect the process. They don't want to pay for the process. Of course, yeah. So quality assurance, what's that? No. Why is it going to take 3 weeks? Why can't you just make it live? Why? My favorite is, why do you have to QA? Like, shouldn't it work? Right? Like, shouldn't it just, maybe we should just not test our bridges, right? Let's just not, let's not quality control our planes and bridges. Like, software is the same thing. Anyways, I want to get a little deeper into the weeds because you have such unique expertise, but where do you see some of the biggest gaps in B2B e-commerce? Like, I think, and I'll give you my perspective so you can take that with a grain of salt, because, just because I know a lot doesn't mean I'm not wrong, right? Like, and I'm very open to being wrong, but I see a lot in the ERP to e-com, the front end to back end, like that connection is just very difficult because the data model of Magento or Shopify BigCommerce is not the same as ERP, and the pricing models are the inventory models becomes very difficult, right? So that connection is often, I won't say broken, but even when we make it work, it's like, it's not exactly one for one, right? Like, there's always a gap, right? That's one. 2 is the leadership, right? 3, I feel like, is just the culture, right? Like, I don't know. I mean, what do you think about companies that are processing orders offline that are under 5,000? Like, in B2B, I see a lot of companies, to me, it's like, why are you processing orders, not e-com, that are less than $5,000? Like, that seems kind of crazy to me that you're like taking those over the phone, right? Like, how are they even making money if you have to talk to every person that has a small order, right? You get where I'm going with this? I feel like they don't see the potential of bringing that online. They don't see.
Yeah, so I definitely see that, and I'm going to touch on each of those. And if I forget, then obviously you can remind me probably. So number 1, the data model between different systems, right? That's what you wanted to talk about. So typically, when you look at the ERP is a very large system in general. Even if you look at the smallest of the smaller system, that is probably going to be very large in size, the way it is designed. You are probably going to have 200 tables, 1,000 tables, sometimes 10,000 tables, depending upon the complexity of the ERP.
Yeah.
The way ERP systems are designed, I
thought Magento had a lot of tables, but I think compared to ERP, it's like peanuts. Like, it's like, oh, we got 500 tables. You're like, no, we got 10,000.
Exactly, because the way the ERP systems are designed, it's designed to support every single business model.
All the functions, HR, accounting. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Okay, so it's the humongous programming language ever created, right? So it's almost like a programming language that you are trying to program your business processes in. Now, there are like a million ways to do that. Okay,
Infinite, just right? I mean, you could do the same thing 1,000 different ways, right? You could make the product 1,000 different ways, right? So, yeah.
Exactly, and that's where the data mapping between your Magento, how the data needs to be mapped, is going to be very tricky, because the way you are going to map is going to
My favorite is like, oh, we want to do this integration. How much is it? I'm like, well, it could be an app, or it could be $300,000. It's like,
exactly.
How much is your house? Well, you could buy a broken house for $50,000, or you could buy a house in New York for 20 million. Like,
exactly.
It's like, I don't think people understand the massive variability in these projects, right? We're talking things that can be a difference of thousands of hours theoretically, right?
Exactly. And the design is very important as well. Design is what dictates whether your integration is going to work or not. And design,
is it stored as a string? Is it an integer? Is it a multi-select? You know what I mean? All these data fields, like, they're not the same. That's the problem we run into all the time.
So you have the technical perspective. You also have the business perspective. Okay, business perspective from the accounting perspective. Things are very different. The way their companies are structured, the way their SKUs are recognized, the way they are recognizing revenue, the way they are processing the orders. So there are going to be some legal limitations in terms of how they are doing things, and that is going to drive, what data elements you are going to have. And that's why, so it's not just the technical conversation. It's also the business conversation, how your business processes are going to be modeled. And that's the programming I'm talking about between your e-commerce and ERP system. And it's not, when you are making just 2 connections, things are still easy. When you are patching together 15 different databases and trying to build the reconciliation model, rocket science. Okay, in general, when you are saying, okay, my inventory move from this particular system to this, and then this system augments this particular data field, then this goes to the customer, and that's what is your customer experience. It's very, very, very hard to model.
Once you start introducing POS, OMS, and then I think people underestimate CRM, right? Because then they're like, well, really all our customer records are in Salesforce, right? And now we got to reconcile Salesforce with Magento, with NetSuite. And it's like, these are not simple problems. And it's not, okay, buy a Boomi license, buy a Sligo license, and hire some cheap developer and it's going to get done. Like, I think people really underestimate this complexity,
Development is always the easiest part in general. Once you define a spec, and typically in manufacturing, if you are going to be manufacturing anything, when you go to the shop floor, these guys are going to have some sort of spec.
Yeah, they're not figuring out how to make the product. They're following instructions, right?
Exactly. Like,
I don't think they realize if you tell, but that's the problem is companies say, hey, developer, go integrate this thing. There is no spec, right? And they don't realize that you probably don't necessarily want just the developer making the spec. You want business intelligence combined with the developer, right? Like you want the business and the developer in conjunction to make the spec, right? Like, do you get where I'm going at? Because if you just throw it off over the fence to the developers, like, who knows what you're going to get back,
And there is a layer in between, okay? So if you look at the pure software development, to be honest, I mean, the companies, they are into the real software development. For example, let's say if you look at Shopify, the developers is going to be the lowest sort of common denominator, okay? The way they like to work and think. You are going to go through the architecture and the design process. So first, phase always is going to be analyzing the requirement. Now, my business guys, they are sort of good at processing the transactions. They can probably make the decision, but they have never sort of built a framework around a system. So for them, it's very, very, very hard to find the requirements that are going to be technically as well as financially feasible. That's where the requirement analysis phase comes in. Then you have the architecture phase. Okay, so these all are the.
I think that what you said is really important though, because people come in with these budgets, right? And they're like, I want this crazy scope, but they only have 150 grand. And I think that's like the matching of the budget and what's possible within that budget. There's not enough thought goes into that, right? Like, because they just say, build me this thing for 150. Like, you don't know, what you're going to get. Like, they don't, you know what I mean? Like, I think there's just a misalignment there, right?
Exactly. And that's always been a challenge with software because you have so many different variables that typically control the outcome. So unless you go through this phase, because whatever you want, I don't know whether you are looking for this because you never told me at the line level. Okay. So I don't know whether you remember.
So why don't you know? That's when you get in the project. Why didn't you know?
Because I cannot read your mind.
They're written down. Is it in the scope work? Oh no, yeah. Yeah.
So I know this is the first question. You wanted to cover the second one as well, right? The leadership as well as the culture, I guess.
Just what are you seeing as failing? Like, and it could be completely different than what I'm thinking, but B2B e-commerce, in my opinion, is still way behind, right? B2C, you expect e-commerce. Like, you got Amazon, you've got, like, it's down, right? Like, you have Shopify. Yeah, is it getting better? It eventually, I think we'll get to 30% online. We'll hit B2B, B2C. But B2B, it's like, I mean, I talked to a pretty big company and the guy's like, oh, we tried to do it, it didn't work.
Yeah.
And they're big.
You didn't do it right away.
And they sell product. And I'm like, so, I mean, are people calling you? Like, it just seems crazy to me that they're going to just say like, oh yeah, we'll just have people call us or email us. Like, that's going to be their business model. Like, for how much longer can that continue without that becoming obsolete, and someone else just automating that? I mean, look at Tesla. I think Tesla is a good example, right? The cars, never figured out how to sell direct, and now Tesla's selling direct, and they're kicking their ass because they don't have to give all the margin away to the middleman, right? And so B2B commerce, I feel like, covers some of that, but it's happening very slowly, I feel like, you know?
Yeah, and to that comment, this is what I like to say: if you don't figure this out, somebody else will. Okay, and typically these are going to be either private equity companies or the larger companies.
I think the private equity companies are going to kick all these people's ass because you're sitting around saying, "Oh, we don't need to do it," but they are investing. I know pretty deeply how much they're investing in some of this stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And they have done this multiple times. They bring the right advisor, they do it right way. So in this particular case, the argument is going to be, hey, I drove the car, it just didn't work for me, so I'm never going to drive. That's not how car driving works. Okay, you have to go through the process. You need to learn how cars work. Okay, once you have done enough cycles, then one day you'll figure out that, okay, now cars are supposed to work like this. So
yeah,
again,
they're like, oh, our customers didn't buy on the site. Well, it's like, but why? Right? Like, that doesn't mean that no one's willing to buy on the site. It's like, was the experience bad? Did you not train them? Did your sales reps not believe in it? You know what I mean? There's so many reasons why these things fail. I think that's the problem, you know?
Exactly. But I mean, when you look at the cost element and the training element, to be honest, okay, if you are going to be hiring these salespeople who are going to be processing the orders, that's great. You know, but at the same time, these people are going to be, number one, extremely expensive, obviously. And then, you know, your business is dependent upon them, which is okay if you have been operating like that. But if you are going to have the B2B commerce component, number one, you get a ton of insight. You have no idea how much insight you are going to get in your business that you never had. Okay, so number one, data. Number two is going to be the cost element. If you do it right way, then this is going to scale by itself. You can scale far more.
Those $1,000 transactions, like, there's no way it's profitable for some of these companies taking a phone order for $1,000. You know what I mean? It's like, because their especially your distribution, your margin's not that high in distribution, you know?
Exactly.
And they're going to follow up. Oh, where's my order? Where's my order? How many times are they calling you for that $1,000 order, you know, an email? You know what I mean? It's like, it's not like they're making 1,000. It's got to get shipped, cost of goods. They're probably only making like $200 on the order, you know?
Exactly. And that's where I guess there is plenty of opportunities in general for the SMB to figure this out, right? But again, there are two ways, the simple way and the hard way. And most of the SMBs, the way they are trying is hard way, just because they don't want to believe that this thing takes a little bit of time and the money and the right expertise. So when you say it's
the hard way, you feel like, what are they doing? They're trying to do it fast, and then they're creating pain instead of taking a little bit more time. Can you explain that a little bit, just so people understand when?
So Isaiah, I think you already answered this. Okay, so if you are going to hire a consultant, I'll give you a story probably, and that will probably.
Yeah, can you give like a story of the hard way and the easy way? Because I don't.
So the easiest story is, okay, I hired a mover. Okay, a mover. How hard moving could be? You have a probably 2-bedroom apartment. You have a bunch of furniture. Mover comes to your house. You are looking for the lowest quote. I'm going to hire the mover that is going to quote me the lowest. Okay, that's how I like to think. I'm a finance guy. Now I hired this mover. Mover agreed that, you know what, I agreed for this price. Sign the contract. We'll move. What mover does is, you know, we pack everything. The stuff goes in the truck. Okay, and after that, the mover says, I am going to be charging you higher than everybody else quoted. Are you paying me or not? Okay, I'm like, I'm not going to pay you. Then what does the mover do? Okay, mover put the stuff on the road for me, and then I ended up spending far more. Yeah, then I paid somebody who was being realistic.
You didn't have the job. Yeah.
Then who was being right? So again, the hard way is going to be that you are not understanding what is required in moving and why this guy should be paid $60 an hour, $50, whatever may be the fair price. Okay, look at the fair price. Don't look for discounts because it will fire back. There is no free lunch, guys. Okay, so again, understand the process, respect the process, figure out what is the fair price of doing these things. Otherwise, there is always going to be a hard way. And most SMBs, they are doing it hard way. They are not doing easy way.
So you think that they're underspending, getting, I mean, you see so many failures, right? So they're underspending, or maybe they get half of it, doesn't really work. And then, yeah, they're going to end up just spending more on the back end on technical debt, fixing things, making something work that never, yeah. I mean, I see it all the time for sure. So yeah, they're just not doing enough due diligence to make the proper investment. Do you think that maybe if they can't afford the proper investment, they should think like maybe it's like, okay, the real quote, the good quote is 300K. They can't afford it yet. Like, what should they do? Like, maybe they should find other ways to save money and build up to pay, or do it incrementally, or so I feel like that's part of the problem. They come up with these random budgets. I don't know where they're coming from, because that's the problem. I'm not their CFO. I don't know where they're coming up with this money, but they always have some random number that's usually lower than what it's probably going to end up being,
Yeah, and Isaiah, you know the answer for this, right? I mean, see, you have probably managed how many projects, and if anybody is from the
hundreds, yeah,
project management background, see, scope, quality, and your budget, they are tied together. They all move together. So again, a good consultant is always going to have an answer for you. If you tell them that I have the budget of 20K, if they feel that they will not be able to deliver in 20K, they'll say you need to find somebody who can probably do that. Okay. Or this stuff really costs.
Well, I think we do that, but they just go somewhere else, right? But they don't,
Well, so again, I mean, you in good consultants, they'll be able to tell you that in 20K you can get this much. Are you willing to compromise on the scope?
Yeah.
Okay. So you have to compromise on
people just aren't willing to compromise on the scope, right? And so that's the crux of it, right? But I think the problem is there's just too many people in the market claiming to be truthful in this, and so they have no idea, right? I mean, if we give them a quote for 200 and someone gives them a quote for 100 grand, how do they know? Like,
And that's where the leadership comes in. I mean, Isaiah, you are also hiring a lot of vendors. I'm hiring a lot of vendors. Do I always get the lowest quote? Never, ever in my life. Okay, I know how bad that fires back. Okay, so again, that's the hiring expertise that people don't have.
I think it's especially important for something as complicated as professional services, right? Like, I don't think it's the end of the world if you get the lowest quote for Walmart, right? Like, you're getting Walmart because you're going to Walmart and you're buying, like, but when you're talking about something this complex, the lowest quote is probably not what you want to do. Right.
Ask deeper questions. Okay. Price should not be the question you should be asking. Understand the process, how these things work, and ask questions. How come you are able to do this cheaper? If they are claiming that they have.
That's what I think is missing, is that people, they go get an RFP. All right, we got to go buy this service. They go get a bunch of quotes, but they really have no idea, because also every agency is going to have a slightly different process, and the thoroughness of that process is part of what drives the cost. We have two processes, actually. We created a more enterprise process to solve these complex problems that's very thorough, but we realize, like, for small Shopify stuff, maybe they don't need that, right? Like, if you just need like a basic Shopify site, you don't need, all these people and consultants to do that. So we created a simpler process for that. But I think a lot of these RFPs, and they don't really actually ever really dig into the process. And they don't really actually know what we're going to do. They just see a number, right? And they probably breeze through the statement of work, and, like, they don't really know what we're actually going to do when you think about it,
Yeah, exactly. So I think, if you have a very seasoned, either procurement person or the buyer, if they have been around the block for a long time, they understand these things. Okay. But again, you need to learn the process in terms
of. Why do you think that why does it feel like there's so few people like that? I don't know. Is it because
it does take a long time to understand these things? It takes a long time to be a good CEO who can hire the right people and build a company that is going to scale to $1 billion.
It's still relatively new, right? So how many people? There's not a lot of people that have been through many projects in B2B. That's why I have this podcast, right? Because, like I said, B2C, I talk to people, they've done 3, 4, 5, maybe on the brand side, they've been through iterations, but B2B, it could be their first project.
Typically, in the ERP world, if you talk to a person who has done their first ERP, their thinking is going to be very different from the person who has done 6th after sixth, they will never do an ERP project in their life. Okay, I've spoken to a lot of CFOs. They have done 5 or 6, and after that, they can never estimate an ERP project. They are never going to touch an ERP project. And the reason for that is now they understood how complex it could be. I'm talking about a story of a person who did every single complex technical project from the manufacturing perspective, probably worked on nanotechnology or whatever. But the toughest project in his life was the ERP project. And the reason for that is because of the number of variables involved and number of uncertainty and the uncertainty that you have.
And personalities involved and things. And yeah, I mean, it's tough, right? It's tough. And I think people really underestimate this stuff, right? But I feel like they got to do something, right? I mean, I feel like there's people that are still kind of like dragging their feet, right? And I mean, we saw, I know, what was it, Southwest that had the blow up. I've had another customer recently that had a technical blow up, not on our side, but on the back office. It's way out of our control. We're talking very deep back office systems that just probably are archaic, right? I mean, a lot of these companies must be on like a ticking time bomb, right? I mean, in terms of this technology just not keeping up, right?
Well, it does take a long time, for a company to be on a time bomb. To be honest, companies survive a lot in general, okay? Again, it depends upon where you are in terms of the maturity. Southwest problem in general was very different. And most people don't really understand what their
So what was that problem? I mean, they said it was a technical problem, but...
So typically the IT systems, the way they work, I mean, most people are going to think that I am going to buy the SaaS and it's going to work for me magically. The IT systems also require the operational capacity planning in terms of, what is going to be your demand, what is going to be the system capacity that you need to.
Yeah. So I get that.
Right. So if there is going to be a peak in demand, and again, we are talking about the whole economy, I guess, here, right? I mean, that's how economy works. The reason why economy is so hard is because it's very hard to manage supply and demand. So that's the same problem even with IT systems as well. So the problem that Southwest faced was more of the operational capacity problem. It's not necessarily the archaic technology problem. Even if you have the newer technology, they will still probably run into the similar issues unless you have planned for that kind of workload.
So they were not prepared for increase in demand, essentially.
It's very hard to prepare for surprises. I mean, we were not prepared for COVID, I guess, as a world. So, if there are going to be situations that are going to be one-off, you cannot plan for those. So again, the whole analysis piece, the way you sort of analyze the IT project, you need to analyze all of these possibilities. You need to forecast, you need to test. You don't need to test all of these one-off scenarios. Typically, a good seasoned CIO, the person who has done multiple IT projects, they are typically going to play by the 80-20 rule. Okay, this is your 80% boundary. Let's do a real good testing of these 80% scenarios. And 20%, I'm not going to touch them because they are just going to be too expensive, too risky.
That's another thing that I think people overlook. I see sometimes people getting way too in the weeds, trying to do, the 20% when it's like, just do the 80% well, and we'll do the 20% in the phase 2, right? Or phase 3. And they're like so caught up with trying to get every feature crammed into phase 1. It's just, yeah.
Yeah, and it's very, very hard unless you have done it again. Once you do it a couple of times, then you would realize how difficult these things are.
So this is why companies never change their ERP.
Well, again,
never. I know they changed their ERP, but I feel
just because you did not learn how to drive a car, it does not mean that the cars are bad.
Yeah. No, we see a lot of people changing ERPs, but it does seem like something that those are long, bigger life cycles, more than e-commerce. E-commerce, I feel like, is probably 3 to 5 years. If you're getting more than 5 years out of your e-com platform, I'd say that's pretty good, right? If you're at like 6 or 7 or 8, I mean, you're probably somewhat lucky, or you need to change. Like, it's time to change, or you're lucky and it just scaled with you for whatever reason. But ERP, it seems like some of these people at 10, 20, I mean, we see people on stuff from the 90s,
Exactly. And sometimes that is going to be the number of variables that are driving the change process. So for example, for e-commerce, I think Google is going to be one of the biggest, okay? Because your Google, and probably rebranding as well. That drives the e-commerce replacements in general. ERP probably does not have that problem. If your business model changes, if you acquire a lot of companies, then you need to change your ERP as well. So it goes through different cycles. So depending upon which industry you are in, which business model you are part of, and what you are trying to do, how quickly you are growing,
Yeah,
and
the
that will
channel,
drive.
I would say the channels and the user experience and the browser experience and the functionality changes e-commerce so fast because, the web is just constantly evolving, but the ERP is a little bit different, right? The business processes, they don't necessarily have to change as quickly, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, unless, like you said, you roll up and you do all these complex things and maybe you start manufacturing and you didn't do that before, So, yeah, I mean, I feel like there's so much more we could get into, but I think we'll just have to bring you back. This is, we're about almost an hour in, which is typically like what we like this. We're not quite Joe Rogan level yet, like 3 hours. But yeah, I mean, I think it's really interesting how you talk about it's almost less the technology and more the process mapping and the architecture and the diagramming and the thoughtfulness around things than so much. I think people get a little too caught up on the tech, right? That's why I'm kind of annoyed with some of the buzzwords and like everyone trying to buy the new buzzword tech, because I think that's not usually the solution,
Exactly. It's going to be the alignment, I guess. And people talk about sales and marketing alignment. The business and IT alignment is equally important. If you are simply going to blame either IT or technology or business, that's not going to cut it. Again, these guys need to come together, and you have to have a process that brings them together. And typically that's going to be your requirement management, requirement negotiation, then a little bit of design architecture, then a little bit of POCs, modeling to give them feel in terms of how the house is going to look when you have that built. And is this what you were expecting? And sometimes that's going to be a training aspect as well, because you require the business process re-engineering. So the way you have been doing so far, maybe you need to change those because in the new state, it's not going to work. So there is a lot of back and forth, and it requires a lot of expertise in general across the system, across the processes, cross-functional expertise. Every discipline is going to be involved in the project.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. I'm going to ask you one last question and we'll wrap up. Like, what's your kind of advice or takeaway if you're a B2B organization trying to get better at B2B commerce? Could be the beginning, could be middle stages. I don't care where they're at, but what would you advise them on, just high level, if you were to give them a takeaway from this?
Yeah, my advice for them is going to be figure out how to analyze things comprehensively. If you have been operated in the siloed manner, it's going to be really hard to get results from B2B e-commerce. But if you cannot figure this out, somebody else is going to do that. There is tremendous opportunity. The companies that are going to figure this out, they are the ones who are going to be making a lot.
So make sure you build that cross-department functionality, because that's, I think, why e-commerce is so hard, because people, it's like marketing. Was it marketing? Is it sales? Is it tech? Is it operations? It's everything. It's like,
it's everything.
Yeah, exactly. And you put one guy in one department in charge of it, well, he relies on all the other departments, and then he's kind of screwed, because if he can't help work with them, well, what's he going to do?
Exactly.
So yeah, I love that. All right. Well, thank you so much. And we'll certainly keep chatting and definitely have you back on again. So
thank you so much for having me, Isaiah. Love your work, love your podcast. Thank you so much once again.
Thank you.